Over here in the Beaumont area once again. I think it's been something in the neighborhood of 2 years since I had an opportunity of visiting here with you and speaking in this congregation. We traveled over to Lake Charles yesterday evening and spent the night over there and had a chance to visit with the Doucettes, and it was very encouraging to see the amount of recovery that Mr. Doucette has had, and I know that you'll be continuing to pray for him and that God will restore him completely, as he certainly does need, and I certainly seems to be well on his way. But anyway, it is very good to be over here and to have a chance to visit with you. As we look around in the world in which we live, as we listen to the news over television or the radio, or you read the newspapers or the news magazines, one of the things that we notice is the fact that the news that we see is generally bad news. I was visiting with Mr. Doucette's brother, Beaumont Texas, just this past Thursday evening there in Houston, and we were talking about some of those things, and he mentioned, he said, you know, he'd commented, I guess, earlier that day, something with some of the men he worked with, and he said, you know, if there wasn't any bad news, it'd put these newspapers out of business, wouldn't it? Because that's generally what they specialize in. But, of course, they're not on the verge of going out of business, because whatever area you want to focus in, there's plenty of bad news for them to report. And whether they want to focus in on the international scene, they want to focus in on some of the problems that are going on over in Europe. And we just recently had Secretary of State Haig's comments at the Madrid meeting, in which he blasted the Soviet Union for their intervention in Poland. And the situation has been tight and has been tense in that area and continues to just fester along. We, in this country, came to the rescue of our big multinational banks, who literally have multiple hundreds of millions of dollars that are at stake in terms of loans to Poland. So Poland is at the point of defaulting on its loans, so the American government picked up the tab and paid the interest, so Poland would not be declared bankrupt. Because if Poland went bankrupt, then you might see a bank failure of some of the big multinational banks headquartered in New York, and we don't want to see that. So the U.S. government, while it is strapped for cash, somehow comes up with the amount of money to pay many, many tens of millions of dollars just in interest on the Polish debt, so that we can somehow preserve the fiction that Poland is not bankrupt. Well, we soon shall be. We pick up the tab for them. We're well on our way. And the situation continues to deteriorate. You look, whether you look in Europe, you look in the Middle East. Just recently, the statement was made that we had prevailed upon Prime Minister Menachem Begin in Israel not to invade southern Lebanon. He had had a plan to do so, and our government had felt that it would destabilize the Middle East. You better believe it would destabilize the Middle East. So we managed to talk Begin into not doing that, though Begin is an individual who seems to do pretty much what he wants to do. So if he gets ready to invade, I don't know that we're necessarily going to be able to stop him. But we see, as we look around, we see all of the jockeying for power and position. We see various nations trying to maneuver themselves into strategic positions, trying to build their own empire that they can somehow use to hold down or to keep back other nations. We, whether we look at the Soviet Union and its attempts, whether we look at the United States and the accusations being made against us in terms of our actions in Central America, with El Salvador and various other nations down there, we have various jockeying for power among different nations, all striving to ensconce themselves in a permanent place, to somehow come out on top. As we look at history, as we look at the ebb and flow of empires, of various events, that have transpired. And actually, you have to realize that when you look at history, you're only looking at prophecy from another standpoint. Prophecy is history that is written in advance. You look backward on the events of history, you look forward on the events of prophecy. But it's basically the same thing, just seen from a little different perspective. As we look at the things that are going on in the world today, as we look at the history of the rise and fall of nations and empires, the ebb and flow of events, are all of these things simply a matter of time and chance? Is it simply a matter of happenstance? Is it simply a matter of someone happening to be at the right place at the right time? The Apostle Paul, back in the book of Acts chapter 17, speaking to the Athenians gathered on Mars Hill, made a statement that serves to make clear to us certain of these things. He says in verse 24, God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is the Lord of heaven and earth, dwells not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, seeing he gives to all life and breath and all things, and has made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on the face of the earth, and has determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. So we read here that God has determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. So the rise and fall of various empires, of various groupings of people, is not simply a matter of time and chance. God has determined the bounds before appointed. And the times, he's determined the bounds of their habitation, the times before appointed. We read in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32, in verse 7, remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you, your elders, and they will tell you. When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. So we find here that God separated the sons of Adam. The various ethnic groups, God allocated their area of the earth. He separated the sons of Adam. He divided the earth up and gave to each nation, to each ethnic group, its own inheritance. Now, mankind has been engaged in a futile struggle down through the centuries, from the time since Adam, to prove that he can make his own way work. That man somehow can put together the right combination of religion and politics and economics, and can somehow fit it all together and make his own way work. Now, as we look at the things that have come in the scope of the history of this world, as we look at the great empires that have risen, they've all done so under the guise that somehow they were going to solve the problems of the world. You know, Hitler promised a 1,000-year Reich, the Millennium German style. He had his own brand of peace on earth that he was going to bring, a 1,000-year Reich. The communists have their particular brand that they think they can bring. If somehow they can just conquer the whole world and bring a communist government over the whole world, then at that time they will be able to solve all the world's problems. This is what they say. Of course, they haven't been able to solve the problems in the nations that they rule. And they've been there for, quite a number of years. An entire generation has grown up since the Russian Revolution. And certainly the majority of people, the vast majority of people in the Soviet Union today, are people who have been born since that time, since the time of the Russian Revolution. But they haven't been able to solve the problems in their own land. Well, we can look around the world at all the various attempts of different religions. None of which have learned the lesson that the prophet Jeremiah learned. He has recorded for us in the Scriptures in Jeremiah chapter 10 and verse 23, where we learn it's not in, "O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man that walks to direct his steps." The way of man is not in himself. Man does not possess the capacity to order his own direction, to decide and to determine the way that he should go. And when you look at the world and you look at the mess that it is in that mess, it is in that condition because people have sought to solve the problems of the world their own way. Now, God says that He has determined the times before appointed, that He has set the bounds of their habitation. As we look at history, we find that God has given every group of people their opportunity to solve the problems of the world their own way. Everybody has had his chance, and none of them have worked. Mankind is having to learn that lesson, having to write that lesson indelibly in his history, that it's not possible for man, for any group of men, to somehow solve the problems of the world in the way that they should be. Now, if we're going to look, let's pick up the story with the post-flood world, and we see the beginning of human government after the flood with a man by the name of Nimrod, back in Genesis chapter 10. Now, here was the beginning of an attempt to solve the world's problems, to build an empire, to build a kingdom, to build a political and a religious system that would solve the problems. So we read in Genesis chapter 10 and verse 8, "And Cush begat Nimrod." Now, Nimrod was of the family of Cush. Cush is the father of the East African peoples, the Ethiopians in particular, and other groups of people there in the area of East Africa. In fact, anywhere in the entirety of the Old Testament that you see the word Ethiopia, the word in the original Hebrew is Cush. See, the Ethiopians, that's not the name that they use for themselves. That's actually a Greek name. That's the name of the Greek geographers hung on the nation that called itself the people of Cush. And most of our names of ancient nations have come down as we use the Greek names, just like Egypt. Egypt is not the name that the Egyptians call themselves. It's not the name that is used in Egypt. They refer to themselves as Mithra, or Mithraim. The official airlines of Egypt is Al-Mithra. Egypt is just a Greek name that was hung on the nation by the Greek geographers. We look around and we find that generally people give a nation a name that sounds good in their own language, and it's not necessarily what those people call themselves. We talk about Germany, but if you were to go to Germany, they don't call themselves Germans. They don't call their nation Germany. They call it Deutschland. And you find, the difference in pronunciations and the difference in spelling that take place. Well, here was Nimrod of the family of Cush. And we find in verse 8 that Nimrod began to be a mighty one in the earth. The Hebrew word that is translated mighty one here is the word Gibor, and it literally means tyrant or despot. Now, Nimrod began to be a tyrant. He began to be a despot in the earth. He began to tyrannize and to rule over other people. We find he was a mighty hunter before the Eternal. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Now, if you want to read over in the next chapter, chapter 11, you read about Babel and the beginning of Babel and the building of the Tower of Babel. That was where Nimrod started. He gathered all the people together, and he was going to build his own empire. He was going to solve the problems of the world his own way. So he established human tyrannical government. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Well, as you read in chapter 11, you find God put a stop to that. So here was the first kingdom, the first human government after the flood, as man sought to solve his problems his own way, and that didn't work. You find later another African-based empire, the Egyptian Empire, the nation of Egypt, arose in the aftermath of Nimrod's demise. And throughout the period that is covered in Genesis, we find Egypt as the great world power. We find that Abraham went down to Egypt. We find that Isaac went down. We find Jacob went down there in the time of famine. Joseph growing great under the time of the Pharaohs. We find the events that culminated in the Exodus. And actually, at that time, Egypt was ruled over by an Ethiopian dynasty, the 18th dynasty at the time of the Exodus. But we see these events transpire. We see Egypt as a great and dominant power on the world over a period of hundreds and hundreds of years. And yet they didn't solve the problems. They didn't bring peace. Their government, their religion, their political system did not endure. God gave them their opportunity, and they weren't able to solve things. And as we go through, we will find that no group that God has allowed to hold sway has been able to solve the problems, because everyone in his own turn has rejected the government of God. And God has raised up a witness in those areas. You know, just as Abraham went down as God's servant, and Joseph later, and different ones went down to Egypt as God's servant. And there was a witness there that they chose to turn their back on. We find later the Babylonians, and Daniel was there, and again there was a desire, a willingness to turn their back on God's messenger, on God's servant. And we see that all the way down. Human beings wanting to carve out their own system apart from God. And not any of it has worked. Well, when we come on down through the Scriptures, we find in Daniel chapter 2 a great image. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. And in this dream, he saw a great, gigantic image. Now, on this image, there was a head of gold. And then there was a shoulders and chest of silver. There were thighs of brass. And there were legs of iron. And those legs of iron culminated in 2 feet with 10 toes, composed of iron and miry clay. Now, this is back in Daniel chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar wondered what that image was. He wondered what he was seeing, what this symbolized, what it pictured. And Daniel told him, he said, "You, O king, are that head of gold." The head of gold is representative of the Babylonian Empire, the Babylonian kingdom of which you're the king. And after you there shall arise another kingdom, yet inferior to you. And then, a third, and then finally a fourth, that's like iron and is going to break in pieces everything. Now, as we go through history, we find, yes, that's what happened. God had set the bounds of their habitation and the times before appointed. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian Empire, collapsed. It was swallowed up by the empire of the Medes and the Persians. That empire held sway over a period of years, and then it fell before the onslaught of Alexander the Great, Greco-Macedonian Empire. And then, in turn, that empire split, was divided among Alexander's generals after his death, and ultimately was swallowed up by the Roman Empire, which continued on down historically as the 2 legs of iron of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, culminating in the final 10 toes. And then we read that there is to be, in Daniel 2, we read that there is a stone that is cut out without hands that will smash the image on its toes, grind the whole thing to powder. And the stone will grow and become a great mountain and fill the face of the whole earth. That, of course, represents Jesus Christ and His return to this earth, smashing that image on its final end-time restoration, destroying that entire system, and establishing God's government, which is going to fill the whole earth. God has determined the bounds of their habitation and the times before appointed. Now, it's interesting when we read the story and we see the degree to which God has intervened. You know, God prophesied through Isaiah the prophet a couple of hundred years before the event that he would raise up a man by a particular name, a man by the name of Cyrus, that would conquer Babylon and would allow the Jews to return and to rebuild the temple, to rebuild Jerusalem. Jeremiah prophesied to the Jews of his day that they would serve the king of Babylon 70 years. God had determined the time before appointed, and he had allowed a period of 70 years that Judah was to be in subjugation to the king of Babylon. Now, Babylon viewed itself as being an invincible empire, headquartered by an invincible city that could never be conquered. You know, we think in this nation that if we can somehow put enough money into war-making implements, and actually when you check it up, we as a nation, we tithe. Now, you might not be aware of that, but we do. If you'll check up some of the figures, you will find that we pay two different tithes to our gods. You're going to take a figure of approximately 10% of the gross national product. 10% goes into defense and defense-related industries, not just the governmental budget, which is almost that amount, but then when you figure in the other money, that into defense and defense-related industry. So we tithe to the God of war. Another 10% goes of the gross national product of this nation is sucked into the medical realm, the medical expenditures, all of the medical expenses that take place in this nation in a year's time. Incredible figure. So we tithe to the God of war and the God of medicine. But our gods have not been able to give us either peace or health. It ought to tell us something as a nation about the gods to whom we tithe. Because we've rejected the true God as a nation. We don't look to him as our protector and as our provider. We think that we can build up enough armament, we can build up enough missiles, and somehow we can determine the course of world history. God has set the bounds of our habitation and determined the times before appointed. Now, that's what he'd done for Babylon. You know, Babylon built a wall. There was a wall around Babylon. That wall is 335 feet high. That's the height of a 33-story building. That's a tall wall. How would you like to try to scale that one? You want to build a ladder and climb over it? You going to try to jump over that one? Wouldn't work, would it? Babylon felt that it was invincible, great Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar looked and he says, "Is this not great Babylon which I have built?" And he was very impressed. Wall 335 feet high. No way an enemy could get over that. You couldn't drill through them either. The walls were 85 feet thick. They had chariot races around the top of the wall. That's right. They had like a super highway, like 610 loop around Houston or something. They have chariot races there too. You just don't want to be on there when they do. They're liable to race right over you. But it's kind of like that verse back in, I think it's in the beginning of Isaiah, where it says, and of their chariots there is no end. It makes me think of the Houston freeways every time I look out there, and I think about that. There's no end to their chariots. We just fill it with them. Okay? They literally did. They had 85 feet. That's plenty wide. You could have several teams, several chariots racing, several abreast around the wall. And that's what they did. They had ramps coming up from the inside that they would get up there, and then they would, race around. So they felt that they had an invincible city. There was a river that flowed right through Babylon, see? Had the water supply. They had great, gigantic brass or bronze gates that were tremendously heavy, solid. Couldn't break them down, couldn't get in through that way. Well, God had said, it prophesied in Isaiah 44:27. It says, to the deep, be dry, and I will dry up your rivers. I hadn't thought about that. You know, when Cyrus came in, Babylon fell in one night. Babylon fell in one night. What Cyrus had done, unbeknownst to the Babylonians, is a ways upstream. He had his men dig a channel that diverted the course of the Euphrates River. And at the crucial point that evening, as darkness fell, they broke down the dike that separated the Euphrates River from their channel. And the Euphrates diverted. And the water level dropped and dropped and dropped as it flowed under Babylon. And his soldiers just went under the walls and the riverbank. Went under the walls, came up on the other side and opened the gates. People of Babylon were having a big drunken orgy. They were having a real blowout, real blast, because they were protected. They were invincible. The soldiers just came under the walls, under where the riverbank was, the water level had dropped down, came under there, opened the gates, and in came the army, and the city fell one night. God was able to solve the problem. God had determined the times before appointed. So the empire of the Medes and the Persians came up, and it was going to hold sway. Now, this empire had a desire, the Medes and the Persians, they were going to expand their empire. And they were going to conquer the whole world. They already held sway over a huge section of it. They were going to invade from Asia into Europe. They intended to cross into Greece, the area there where the Turkish peninsula comes almost together with Greece, the area we know as the Dardanelles, or as at that time known as the Hellespont. They were going to cross, and Xerxes the Great, the ruler of the Persian Empire, got together an army of 1 million men. It was the largest army ever assembled up until that time. It was the largest army of antiquity, and for quite a while thereafter. He got together this huge army, and he was going to invade Greece. And he knew that Greece would not be able to stand up to this, and so he marched his army across. And they came through Asia Minor, the area that we know as Turkey today, came up there to the Hellespont, and he'd already figured out how he was going to get across. He was going to build a giant pontoon bridge. And he was going to march his soldiers across. Sounded like a good idea, but you know, God just sent a little bit of wind, and the water got choppy, and the pontoon bridge broke to pieces. And Xerxes couldn't get his army across. Smashed up his ships and broke up his pontoon bridge, and Xerxes was very frustrated. Actually, that's the prelude to the book of Esther. Old Xerxes was not, the kind of guy. He was not a real balanced individual. In fact, when his bridge got destroyed, he was so mad that he decided he was going to punish the sea god. He got 100 big men out there with whips, and they were going to give the sea 100 lashes. Real bright fellow, real fine guy. So there you have the prelude to the book of Esther. You think you got problems, just think about poor Esther. That's what she had to put up with. His advisors decided that for the sake of the nation, they better divert his attention, lest he decide to launch another military fiasco. So they got him to come back, and they said, look, what you need is a new wife. And so that occupied his attention for a while, and he didn't get around to raising any more armies. He spent his time, you read the rest of the story. Well, God has determined the times before appointed, and it was not God's purpose to allow the Persians to invade Europe. Because, you see, God was preparing an empire, the beginnings of something in Greece. Macedonia, the rocky hill country up north of Greece. Greece was a combination of little city-states that all warred and fought among themselves. And here Alexander of Macedon swept into the rest of Greece, up from northern Greece, up from the area of Macedonia, put together the beginnings of an empire there in Greece, crossed the Hellespont, he got across, into Asia and conquered the Persian Empire. Inside of a dozen years, Alexander had put together a tremendous empire all the way to India. In fact, even to this day, some of the Afghan tribesmen, certain sections of the Afghans there that are giving the Russians such a hard time, some of them claim descent from the soldiers of Alexander the Great. Alexander's soldiers did their bit to spread Greek civilization across the world, and so you found, very little what they had left behind all the way across, to this day. Of course, that seems to be the way things go with conquering or marauding armies. But they put together their empire, and then Alexander died, cut off in his prime. And his empire split among his generals, ultimately coming out to 4 of them that divided the empire among themselves. God had determined the times before appointed. Now, Alexander was allowed to establish his empire all across the known world of that day. Now, it didn't do what Alexander thought it would do. What God used it for was it spread the knowledge of the Greek language. And so when the New Testament was written, it could be written in Greek, and people all over the known world could understand what was said. Because Alexander had spread the knowledge of the Greek language all over the known world. As he had put together an empire that even though it split among his generals, still retained that Greek sense. The Greek language was used. God is setting the purpose. God is setting the stage for things. God knows where He's going. We look at the world today. Mr. Armstrong's able to go to a place like Hong Kong, right there in China. That's who the people are, in Hong Kong. They're Chinese people. Hong Kong was a part of China up until the British took it in the latter part of the 19th century. And it is today a British crown colony. One of the only ones of those left. Now, needless to say, anyone in Hong Kong who is educated speaks English, because the British have been in charge of the education. They have governed that area. Or you can go into India, you can go into various areas of other parts of the world, and the English language was spread by the colonial empires, the British in particular, the Americans also. And between the English language, the French language, the Spanish language, virtually the entire world, we can communicate through those languages because of the colonial empire, whether you're talking about Central and South America, whether you're talking about Africa, whether you're talking about most of Asia. You see, they've been under the sway of these various colonial empires. So God set the stage for the propagation of the gospel. Otherwise, we would have to go out in, 100 and something different languages. Well, we're able to gradually, there are certain times other languages that are used, but those provide a basis. So what we see is that God again has determined the bounds and the times before appointed. Now, the Roman Empire came up and it swallowed up this Greek-speaking empire that was ruled by the successors of Alexander's generals. And, of course, it's described in Daniel chapter 2 under the guise of the image and the legs of iron. In Daniel chapter 7, we have another description, the same thing. But Daniel saw it in a little different guise. He saw it in the context of great animals or beasts. Came up out of the sea, and he saw first the lion, that symbolized the Babylonian Empire. And then he saw, coming up after that, a bear, which symbolized the empire of the Medes and the Persians. See, the equivalent of this shoulders and chest of silver. Now, the bear is great and ponderous, just as the Persian Empire was. So, we find then in the aftermath of the bear came the leopard. Now, the leopard was a rather strange-looking leopard because he had 4 heads. Well, the leopard symbolized Alexander's empire, the lightning quickness with which he struck, the speed with which he moved. And there were 4 heads, symbolizing that this empire, within a matter of a very few years, split into 4 divisions, 4 sections, among Alexander's 4 leading generals. And so there were 4 heads to this Greek empire. Continued on down. And then there came up a 4th beast, too terrible to describe. It was kind of a composite of all the others. That was the Roman Empire. It describes it as having great iron teeth with which it broke all that it came in contact with. It conquered a larger territory than any of these empires, and was, of course, the one that held sway at the time when the New Testament was written. Now, the Apostle John, in writing the book of Revelation, focuses in on this Roman Empire and makes a description of the same thing that Daniel saw in Daniel chapter 7. Now, in Daniel 7, Daniel describes this picture of these animals, these beasts. He views them from the standpoint of being 4 separate beasts. Now, as we read the story in Revelation 3, John views the same thing. He views it from a little different perspective. He saw a great beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, what Daniel saw had 7 heads. The 1 head of the lion, the 1 head of the bear, the 4 heads of the leopard, and then the 1 head of the final 4th beast. That's 7 heads. Of course, if you go back to Daniel 7, it mentions that the 4th beast had 7 horns upon its head. Well, this is what Daniel sees or what John sees right here. He sees it as one entity, because really it was one system. Now, he sees it as having composite parts of the various animals that made it up. And he sees that the ultimate source of authority was the dragon, Satan the devil. In verse 3, and I saw one of his heads, as it were, wounded to death. And the deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. On down in verse 5. And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. Now here we see a time that was established, that there was a deadly wound that was to occur. And then that deadly wound was to be healed. Now, as we look at the history of the Roman Empire, do we find that the Roman Empire received a deadly wound? Well, yes, we do. It's just a matter of history. The Roman Empire came to an end. The dates that you'll be given in a history book are 476 A.D. Rome was invaded. The last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, abdicated. The Roman Empire ended 476 A.D. It received a deadly wound. Now, was that deadly wound healed? Well, yes, it was. In 554, there took place an event that the history books describe as the imperial restoration. In other words, the healing of the empire, the restoration of the empire, the imperial restoration. The Pope called for Justinian, who was the emperor in the east in Constantinople, called for him to come to Rome, drive out the Vandals, Heruli, and Ostrogoths, and reestablish the Roman Empire. Justinian invaded Italy, pushed out the opposition, came into Rome, and the Pope there crowned him as the new emperor of the West. The Holy Roman Empire was born. The empire that was put together under the behest of the Roman Pontiff, the Pope. 554. Now that empire continued on down through successive revivals, through Charlemagne, who was crowned by the Pope on Christmas Day in 800 A.D., later by Otto the Great, who headed up a German revival in the 10th century. Then a little later, on into the Middle Ages, the Habsburgs of Austria were crowned and were set on the seat of the Holy Roman Empire. They continued on down until finally, in the early 1800s, Napoleon was crowned by the Pope as emperor. Napoleon's demise came in 1814, when he was defeated, when his empire was shattered. Now, let's notice something here. We see that this was to continue 42 months. Now, let's look back. Let's look back here in Revelation 11 just a little bit. Revelation 2 and 3, and let's see what 42 months is the equivalent of. Revelation 11, verse 2, the court which is without the temple, leave out and measure it not. It's given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months. And I will give power unto my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days. Now here we find a period of 42 months and a period of 1,260 days that are mentioned together. Now they are the equivalent, one of another. 42 30-day months equals 1,260 days. Just a matter of multiplying it out. 42 months, 30 days to the month, comes out to 1,260 days. Now, we'll notice here that this 1,260 days, or 42 months, the beast was to continue after the deadly wound had healed. From the imperial restoration in 554 until the collapse of Napoleon in 1814 was exactly 1,260 years. Exactly. The deadly wound was healed, and power was given to continue for 1,260 years. God had determined the times before appointed. It talks here of an empire, it talks here of a beast. It says that upon his heads was the name of blasphemy. Well, this was the empire that was called the Holy Roman Empire, which was a blasphemous title, because the only God is holy, and the only one, holy and reverend is His name. The only way that something can be holy is that God puts His presence there. And if there is anything where God's presence was not, it was the so-called Holy Roman Empire. So here we see an empire that held sway, just as God prophesied that it would. The Most High rules in the affairs of men. He sets over nations whomsoever He wills, sometimes even the basest of men. People think that they determine. Man still hasn't learned that lesson. People get all excited about they're going to go down and elect old Honest Joe. Boy, he's going to solve the problem. Now, people have their ideas. Some people think if they can get a Democrat in, he'll solve the problem. There are others that are fully persuaded if they can get a Republican in, he'll solve the problem. Some think what we need is more liberals, and others think what we need are more conservatives. And, there are various ideas and various approaches, and you can run the gamut of various political ideologies that have been tried. And the point is, none of them have worked over the long term. Because there is only one sure foundation upon which something can build. And nothing can be any more substantial and any more firm than the foundation upon which it is built. That's a pretty basic thing. And some of you, I'm sure, are in the building trade and various building trades. If the foundation that you lay is weak and shoddy, then anything you build on top of it, you're going to have problems with. If you don't, why do they go to so much trouble? You see them building a big bridge or something. Go down to the, why not just stick the thing up out there? Well, obviously, if you've ever been involved in that or know anything about it, you realize there's a very good reason they don't just stick the thing up out there. Because it'll fall down. The whole thing. Nothing can be more substantial than the foundation upon which it is built. And the foundation upon which all of the human empires, the human governments have been built is a weak and shoddy foundation. Because the Word of God is the only sure foundation. And none of them have been built upon that Word of God. So the Roman Empire did not hold up. There's going to yet be a restoration, a revival of that. We're going to notice some things on that in just a few minutes.
But as we look down through the centuries, we find that there have been various attempts of different peoples, different groups of peoples, to inaugurate their own empire, their own world-ruling system that somehow was going to solve the world's problems. Now, you know, Ishmael, the son of Abraham, the illegitimate son of Abraham, the older brother of Isaac, chafed under the fact that he was not given the birthright. His descendants had done so, and they sought to acquire the birthright by their own efforts. They sought to carve out an empire that would solve the problems. The Islamic empire, the Arab empires of the early Middle Ages, beginning prior to what we term the Middle Ages, beginning in the 7th century A.D., spreading out from Arabia, sweeping across the entire Middle East, sweeping across North Africa, coming into Spain, all the way up into France, where finally in 732 the invading armies of Islam were defeated by Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours. And the whole history of Europe was therefore changed, because if they had poured on into Europe, the whole context of everything would have been different. There would have been Islamic Europe rather than Catholic Europe. God had determined the bounds of their habitation, and they were turned back at that point. They were not allowed to come further, just as God turned the Persians back at the Hellespont. He turned the Arabs back at the Battle of Tours. Ishmael sought to carve out his empire. Well, you know, you come on down a little bit further, and Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Esau sold his birthright, but then he wanted it back. And his descendants, the Edomites of the Turks of today, they sought to get the empire back. They sought to acquire the birthright. And as they came in the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages, pouring into the Middle East from the area of Central Asia, the highlands, and invading the Middle East, conquering the Arab Empire, swallowing that up, conquering the area that is modern-day Turkey, sweeping across much of the Middle Eastern world, virtually all the Middle Eastern world at that time, coming all the way up into Europe, having come all the way to the gate of Vienna, the capital of the Holy Roman Empire, at which point they were turned back. Again, something that would have completely changed the complexion of European history. God was not going to allow them. He had set the bounds of their habitation. They were not allowed to come on in any further. You read, you know, the various other peoples. The Chinese had their fling, you know, under Genghis Khan and his Mongol hordes, as they put together an empire, swept into China, swept down from the steppes of Mongolia, sweeping into China, conquering all of China, sweeping across Asia, all the way across modern-day Russia. That's why the Russians and the Chinese hate each other to this day, because the Chinese ruled over Russia all the way on up until well into the 1400s, before the Russians began to gradually acquire their independence. So they hate each other, and they don't trust each other right on down to this day. And they swept all the way across. Nothing could stand in their way. They were already invading Europe, coming into Hungary, and the only thing that turned them back was the son of Genghis Khan, who was leading this group called the Golden Horde. And the only thing that turned him back was the fact that word reached him that his father had died back in China. And he decided that he better take his army and turn around and go back there, because he knew that his brothers were going to get together and carve up the pie. And if he wasn't there to do his share of the carving, then he was probably going to get left out. And so Europe was spared. God had determined the bounds of their habitation. They put together a vast empire, but they were unable to solve the problem. Their empire split and splintered and fell. You know, you go down through the centuries, the Spaniards sought to build their empire. They began to colonize South America, Central America, much of North America, carving out a gigantic empire. And they discovered the gold and the silver of the New World. They were going to expand that empire. And they put together the greatest fleet of ships that had been known in Europe up until that time, the Spanish Armada. They were going to invade England and restore a Catholic sovereign to England. You know, it's interesting, the English could not have stood up against the Spanish Armada. They were outmanned, outgunned in every way. But you know, it was really a very simple thing. God simply sent a storm. And the Spanish Armada cracked up. And what was left of it finally crippled home. It was interesting, the British issued a coin right after the defeat of the Spanish Armada. The British issued a coin. They recognized that they hadn't won the battle. The inscription on the coin came from the book of Psalms. Blew, and they were scattered. Because that's literally what happened. God blew, and they were scattered. God had determined the bounds of their habitation and the times before appointed. All he had to do was just blow. They were scattered. They're little ships. You know, God's not impressed. See, we look around and people are scurrying to and fro, and some people are strutting to and fro. And they're very impressive to other people. You know, God looks down and he's not impressed. You ever look down a little anthill? You see the little ants down there scurrying to and fro. Some of these little ants carry their burdens. You know, you can look now, if you look at it real carefully, you see them carrying loads that are about as big as they are. And they're scurrying around, you know, and there are other little ants there. If you could look down and really realize what was going on, there are little ants there that are in charge of some of these other ants. You know, the ants are divided up into various categories. They're what we call a social insect. There are various divisions of labor among them. Now, you look down at this little ant, you know, and maybe he's the head ant. But, you know, you're not very impressed, are you? You don't look down there and just, you know, you're amazed at how important this little ant is. So you just take your foot. There goes the anthill and all the little ants. The important ants and the unimportant ants and all the ants in between. You know, God looks down at the earth and he sees like a bunch of little ants scurrying around down here. And some of these little ants think they're very important. And they're all swelled out and strutting around, and other little ants are kind of standing in awe of them. And God just, you know, he just take his finger and go like that, and all the little ants are gone. God's not impressed. The Most High rules in the affairs of men. He sets over nations whomsoever he wills, sometimes even the basest of men. God is allowing the human race to write a lesson of human experience, that we cannot solve our own problems our own way. It's not in man that walks to direct his steps. God has determined the bounds and the time. You know, God gave his blessings to Israel, and Israel was given a firm foundation upon which to build if they would. The covenant that God had given them, based on the law of God. God made some promises back in Leviticus 26 of some things that were going to happen. If Israel would not obey the terms of the covenant, if they would not walk in God's statutes, various things were going to come upon them. And in verse 17, he says, I will set my face against you, and you shall be slain before your enemies. They that hate you shall reign over you, and you shall flee when none pursues you. And if you will not yet for all this hearken unto me, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins. Now, let's notice here, what does God mean? What is this 7 times? Let's notice back in Revelation chapter 12. Now, we already saw a little bit earlier that 42 months and 1,260 days is the same thing. Now, let's notice another equivalent. Revelation chapter 12, in verse 6. The woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. In other words, 1,260 days. Now we come on down in verse 14, and we read, And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time. Now, 1,260 days is equated here with a time, times, and half a time. How long is that? Well, 1,260 days also equated with 42 months. How long is 42 months? 3.5 years, isn't it? 36 months is 3 years. 6 more makes 42. 3.5 years. 1,260 days, 42 months. Now here we read a time and times in half a time. So the time, one time, times would be 2, and a half a time would be, add up, you get 3.5. So in this context, we're talking about 3.5 years. Time, times, and half a time, 1,260 days, 42 months. Same thing. Now, we notice back in Leviticus 26. God says, if you will not throw all this hearken unto me, then I will punish you 7 times. Now, 7 times is twice as much as 3.5. So you double 3.5, you get 7. You double 1,260, you get 2,520. 2,520. Now, God told Israel, He said, if you won't listen to me when I begin to bring these things about, I'm going to punish you 7 times. 2,520 years. Now, the events that transpire we see that northern Israel was invaded in 721 B.C. The Assyrians poured in. Between 721 and 718, northern Israel was totally defeated, and the people were removed away, were made slaves, transported away. 2,520 years from the time that they were completely deprived of the birthright. 2,520 years later, from that point in 721 to 718. 2,520 years later brings you out to the years 1800 to 1803. Now that is when God began to restore the birthright blessing to Israel. So He determined the bounds of our habitation, the times that were before appointed. Here the birthright was held in abeyance for a period of 2,520 years. And then at the end of that time, the English-speaking world began to rise into prominence. The British Empire began to come on the scene. Louisiana Purchase, which was the single largest territorial acquisition this country has ever received, took place in 1803. We didn't set out to carve out a great empire for ourselves. We weren't trying to acquire Louisiana. Thomas Jefferson, the President of the United States, simply wanted to purchase the port of New Orleans. To have a port where goods shipped down the Mississippi River, because it was the only transportation, that was our western border. And we had the port of New Orleans, and we had a way to get our goods out into the Gulf. And that's all he wanted to buy. Napoleon wouldn't sell it to him. He said, I'll sell you all of Louisiana, though, for about $0.05 an acre. You go out and try to, buy some land over there now for $0.05 an acre. Of course, there's a lot more than Louisiana. It started with Louisiana and extended all the way on up to the Canadian border. The whole midsection of the United States. One fell swoop. God determined the times that were before appointed, began to bless this nation. And the whole continental United States just fell into our hands. Texas won its independence in 1836. You realize that Texas petitioned to join the Union at that time and was turned down? That's right. It was not a matter that the American government was so far-sighted that it set out to carve out a vast empire to run from sea to sea. It was pushed off on us. We were presented as a nation with a fait accompli in 1836. And Congress turned it down, said, no, we don't want it. What do we want with Texas? Sometimes maybe Texas today wonders, what do we want with everybody else. Well, we're stuck with each other, see? It was actually 9 years later, in 1845, before Texas joined the Union. There was considerable opposition. It was a very controversial topic. The presidential election was fought over that issue. You just go through and you read the story of the way that we acquired the various things that make up the United States, the way Britain acquired its possessions. In the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, known in American history as the French and Indian War, Britain had defeated France. And here's another one. See, France, the descendants of Brother Reuben, the eldest son, the one who, under other circumstances, would have been entitled to the birthright, who forfeited the birthright because of his conduct and sought in vain to always get it back. Reuben, France was everywhere first. They were in Canada first. They were in Louisiana first. They were, for that matter, in India and in Australia first. They were at the Suez Canal first and the Panama Canal first. They had first chance. But it always slipped through their fingers because God had determined the bounds of their habitation and the times before appointed. And when the time came, the birthright blessings were to go to the sons of Joseph. It's interesting. You just go through, even through British history, and read, the statement that was made, and you realize that how literally true it was, that Britain stumbled into its empire in a fit of absent-mindedness. That's the descriptive phrase that's been used, and it very much was. You realize the way in which they were just kind of maneuvered into various things. And they didn't realize the significance of some of the things that they acquired and some of the things that they had. The British North America Act, where the nation of Canada was actually created back in the 1800s, Parliament spent virtually no time debating that. Took them about 10 minutes to pass it. They spent the rest of the day arguing over a very important subject, the licensings of dogs in some little hamlet there in England. They spent the whole day debating on something important. See, it didn't take them 10 minutes to pass the DNA Act. Nothing over there but a bunch of Indians and beaver skins. Well, God knew what he was doing. God carved out an empire, and he gave to our people, and we have been losing that empire. Britain, in the aftermath of Napoleon's fall in 1814, Britain came to an unparalleled height, and for 100 years was unchallenged as the number one power of the world, the number one world power for 100 years, from 1814 on up till the time of World War I. In the aftermath of World War I, the United States and Britain basically stood together as dominant powers in the world. And then in the aftermath of World War II, Britain began its decline. They came up first and they've gone down first. We're very quickly following suit. We could go on, we could look at other things. Let's notice an interesting prophecy that has importance for us today. It deals with the time setting in which we find ourselves in the immediate future. Let's notice back in Daniel chapters 4 and 5. We have an interesting story that's told in Daniel chapter 4, and we see that chapter 5 actually continues on, and chapter 4 provides a setting for chapter 5. In Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. And in this particular dream, we read in Daniel chapter 4 and verse 10, "Thus were the visions of my head in my bed. I saw and behold a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height thereof was great. The tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto heaven, and the sight thereof to the end of all the earth. The leaves thereof were fair, and the fruit thereof was much, and it was meat for all, and the beasts of the field had shadow unto it. And then he saw in this vision a voice from heaven that came and said, Cut down the tree. And he was a little bit disturbed by this and didn't know what it meant. Daniel understood the meaning of the dream, and he told him, he said, Look, this dream portends serious things for you. You'd better break off your sins by righteousness so that perhaps the events described here will be postponed. Because what it means is that you are going to lose your kingdom. You're going to be driven forth from among men for a period of 7 times. Or as it was in the life of Nebuchadnezzar, 7 literal years. You're going to be driven forth from among men. And then at the end of this 7 times, you will return and you will come into the empire of Babylon once again. Once more, you will rule Babylon. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, as the king, typified the kingdom, the system. He was punished for 7 years, and then at the end of the 7 years was able to regain control over Babylon. You can read the story in chapter 4. I won't go into the detail here for the sake of time, but I think you're familiar with it. Now in chapter 5, we pick up the story with an account in the life of Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, Belshazzar. Now Belshazzar reigned as king of Babylon jointly with his father, Nabonidus. This was the son-in-law, Nebuchadnezzar, and was the king of Babylon, along with Belshazzar. Nabonidus was in a different area of the empire. He was away from Babylon at the time that Babylon fell. And so Belshazzar was holding court as king in Babylon. That is why that when he wanted to reward Daniel, he offered to make him the 3rd ruler of the kingdom, because Belshazzar himself was already number 2. Therefore, number 3 was as high as he could offer Daniel. So Belshazzar was having a great party. He was having a real blowout. He had a feast going, and they drank wine, and they were pretty well along in the wine drinking. And he tasted the wine, verse 2, and he commanded to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple from Jerusalem. So by this time, old Belshazzar was pretty well found. And he'd come up with a good idea. I know what we need. We need some new drinking vessels. And so he sent in, they brought in these vessels of gold and silver, sacred vessels, from the temple. And so, verse 4, they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver and brass and iron and wood and stone. You know, I'll drink to that. Well, I'll drink to that. And so they were toasting one thing after another. You know, any excuse will do. You know, somebody trying to get bombed, they don't have to look too hard and too long to find excuses to do so. So they had a bunch of gods. You know, they were posing a toast to every god. They were just working their way down the list. You know, that's something to drink to. Couldn't offend this god, but not drinking to him. Couldn't offend that one. So, you know, they were just having a real blowout. And by this time, as you read the story, they were pretty well soused. The only thing is, old Belshazzar got sobered up in a real big hurry. It worked better than black coffee. He saw a hand just appear out of nowhere and began writing on the wall. And that did wonders. He came awake and alert. You know, his eyes popped open. It says that verse 6, the king's countenance was changed. His thoughts troubled him so that the joints of his loins were loose, and his knees smote one against another. You know, really shook him up. Scared the daylights out of him. All the joints of his loins were loose. You ought to look that up. Find out what that actually meant. His knees smote one against another. And so he began to cry out, you know, hey, what does all this mean? And he began to call the astrologers and asking, you know, to bring in different ones to tell him what this meant. They were unable to read it, and he was promising all kind of rewards. I'll make you 3rd ruler of the kingdom. So this scared him to death, and here was this writing up there on the wall. Heard the phrase, the handwriting on the wall. Well, here it was. So finally, the Queen Mother came in, and she said, look, you want to know what this means? There is a man who in the lifetime of Nebuchadnezzar was known as an individual that could reveal secrets. And if you really want to know what it means, you better call for him. His name is Daniel. So they brought in Daniel. In verse 17, Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be to yourself and give your rewards to another. You know, I don't need what you have to give. In fact, when Daniel interpreted the dream, you realize Daniel knew, or not the dream, but the handwriting, Daniel knew that the things weren't going to last. Any gift he was given by Belshazzar wouldn't last more than a few hours, because the result of this, was Babylon was falling. Guess who's coming up under the bridge outside? That's the news Daniel had for him. So he said, I'll make the writing known of the king, make known to him the interpretation. So then he begins to go through and he says, now look, you know, God taught Nebuchadnezzar, your ancestor, your forefather, a lesson for a period of 7 times. He was without his kingdom. At the end of 7 times, he was restored to his kingdom, so that he might learn that the Most High rules in the affairs of men, sets over nations whomsoever he will, and gives it, you know, to whomever he wants to. And he said in verse 22, you, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew these things. You knew what had happened to Nebuchadnezzar, but you didn't let it affect you. Now, I'm going to tell you what you've seen. This is the writing that was written. Verse 25, this is the writing that was written, meaning tikal upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing, meaning God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tikal, you're weighed in the balances and are found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Verse 30, in that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Mede took the kingdom. That very night. Weighed in the balances, found wanting. Now, these words that were written up there, what was mysterious about the writing was not the words themselves. These words were numbers or units of measurement, units of weight. And the Hebrew units of weight, the Babylonian units of weight were basically the same, slight variation in spelling. That was not the problem. You see, they recognized the words, but it's like if you saw handwriting on the wall and the words that were written up there were, you know, pounds, tons, and ounces. You would recognize the word. Yeah, I know what that means, you know, pounds, tons, and ounces. But what does it mean? See, it would be meaningless. Even though you might be able to read the words and you realize that here were, units of weight, yet the significance of it would be totally meaningless. You wouldn't have a clue. That's what this was. It wasn't that they didn't recognize the words, it was that they had no idea what the significance of it was. It was just as meaningless as pounds, tons, and ounces, which is a pretty good rendering of what was written up there. Now, it's interesting. These 3 units of measurement that are mentioned here, the mina, the shekel, and the perez. You notice in verse 25 it says upharsin, and in verse 28 it says perez. The U is just it's the same as the word in Hebrew. It's the word and. And unfortunately, in verse 25, the translators render it as part of the word. Well, it was, but it just meant and perez, or parson. Parson was the plural, more than one perez. So the mina, the shekel, and the perez are the units of measurement that are mentioned here. Now, we find here in verse 26, we'll notice, God has numbered your kingdom, you're weighed in the balances, your kingdom is divided. Here were numbers that were weights that were to be divided. Now, it's interesting, the shekel was the smallest unit listed here among these. It took 50 shekels to make 1 mina. It took 25 shekels to make 1 perez. Now, mina is mentioned twice. Mina, shekel, and perez. Now, if you were to take these numbers that are weights and divide them down to the smallest common number or denominator, the mina, which is 50 shekels, plus another mina, which is 50 more shekels, plus a shekel, which is 1 shekel, plus a perez, which is 25 shekels. You add that up and you come up with 126. And you might think, well, what meaning does that have? Where's the meaning there? Well, let's turn back over to the book of Leviticus. Notice here in the last chapter of Leviticus, chapter 27 and verse 25, and all your estimation shall be according to the shekel of the sanctuary, 20 gerahs shall be the shekel. Now, here was a unit that was smaller than the shekel, 20 gerahs. 20 gerahs equals 1 shekel. Now we add this up here in Daniel chapter 5, and we find these numbers, which were weights, which were to be divided. We divide them down, and we come up with 126 shekels, or, since there are 20 gerahs to the shekel, you just multiply 20 times 126, you come up with 2,520 gerahs. If you take the numbers that are weights and you divide them down to the smallest components, or the smallest unit of measurement, the smallest number that is a weight, you have 2,520. Now Nebuchadnezzar had been deprived of his kingdom for 7 times. We saw a little earlier that 7 times is 2,520 days. Now here, Daniel comes along and he tells Belshazzar, he said, look, an example happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He was deprived of his kingdom for a period of 7 times, 2,520 days, before he got it back. And you should have learned a lesson from that. You did not. The Babylonian Empire did not learn a lesson from what Nebuchadnezzar went through. And so that very night, the Babylonian Empire fell. Babylon fell that very night in the fall of 539 B.C. Now, there was a period here, 2,520, that would elapse before Babylon would be able to be put together again. You know, when we read the description in Revelation 17, we do not read of Rome the Great, mystery, Rome the Great, or mystery, Greece the Great, or mystery, Persia the Great. We read of mystery, Babylon the Great. Babylon fell in 539 B.C. There was to be a period of time, 7 times, 2,520 years, will pass over Babylon. Prior to the elapse of that time, it will be impossible for Babylon the Great to arise. All of the attempts that man has made to put it all together, they have been unsuccessful. God has determined the bounds of their habitation, the times before appointed. Now it's interesting. You take 539 B.C. and you add to it 2,520 years and come forward. Remember to add in a year because there's no year 0. You go from 1 B.C. to 1 A.D. There's not a 0 in between. The way normally if you would graph out, going from plus to minus, or minus to plus, you'd come to 0. Well, 2,520 years, if you add that to 539, you come out to 1982. I'll do your addition for you. You just add that up, and you come out to 1982. Fall of 1982, we'll see the completion of the 7 times, the 2,520 years that were to come on Babylon. Now, that does not mean that Babylon the Great is going to suddenly appear in the fall of 1982. That is not what I'm saying, and I don't think this is necessarily the implication of the prophecy. 2,520 years elapsed that Israel was deprived of the birthright. Israel did not come into total possession of the birthright blessings, just from one day to the next. But there were significant events, very significant events, that happened at that time that allowed the British Empire and the American expansion to take place. We are living in momentous times. We are living in the year that is going to see the completion of the 2,520 years, or the 7 times that have passed over Babylon. And it is in the aftermath of that time that Babylon the Great will arise. Again, not necessarily, I'm not saying it's going to arise, that day or that week or that month, or that it's going to arise completely in 1982. That's not what I'm saying at all. But there will be significant events that will take place. That are going to be very significant. And exactly how long it's going to take from the completion of the 7 times until Babylon the Great fully on the scene. It will be something that we have to wait and see. We need to understand, brethren, that we are living in the days that God calls the last time. God says, know you this also, that in the last days perilous times shall come. We're living in a time that God says is going to be a time of perilous times. We're living in an area of the country right here that is relatively prosperous by comparison to much of the rest of the country. There are layoffs in various areas. I think perhaps Lake Charles has been more affected by it than Beaumont has. Over into the Houston area, even though there have been certain layoffs and there are certain job problems that some members have had, nevertheless, that some people have had, not just members, we still are in relatively good shape by comparison with much of the rest of the country. What we have to realize, brethren, is it's not going to go on forever. This age is drawing to a close. The Most High rules in the affairs of men. He sets over nations whomsoever He wills. He's determined the bounds of habitation and the times before appointed. We read here in the book of Daniel, in chapter 7, that Daniel saw, in verse 13, one like to the Son of Man come with clouds of heaven and come to the Ancient of Days. In verse 14, there was given unto him dominion and glory and a kingdom, and all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. Daniel went on to say in verse 17, these great beasts which are four kings, 4 kingdoms, 4 empires, which shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall take the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. Brethren, Jesus Christ is soon going to return to this earth. And He's going to put an end to man's misgovernment. Man has had his chance, and it hasn't worked. Man has sought to carve out his own solutions, his own empires, his own religions, his own political ideologies, to solve his own problems his own way. God has allocated a time space to every group of people, to every aspect of people. And He's allowed every one of them to prove that they cannot do it, because none of them is built on the only sure foundation. The kingdom of God is going to stand forever and ever, because it is built on the only sure foundation. And brethren, the only way that we're going to stand and be a part of that kingdom which is going to rule forever and ever is that our lives are built on that only sure foundation. That we are walking with God and growing and overcoming. We're drawing near to God. That we're drinking in of God's Holy Spirit, allowing God to work and move in us, allowing God to transform us by a renewing of our minds. Transform, converted, to where God can use us, can mold us into a people prepared to meet the Lord. A people prepared to rise, to meet Jesus Christ in the air, to descend with Him on the Mount of Olives, to be a part of establishing the government of God, the kingdom of God. A kingdom that will rule the entire world forever, even forever and ever. Brethren, that is the kingdom to which we have been called.